16. Spencer Ros Pearson. In June of 2023, a star softball player named Madison Shemitz and her mum, 43-year-old Jackie Roger, met with some friends at a restaurant in Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, for dinner. They were seated at an outdoor table when the group spotted Madison's ex-boyfriend, 18-year-old Spencer Ros Pearson, sitting at a table nearby. Less than a week earlier, Madison and her mum had filed a police report against Pearson for allegedly following her on her way to school and leaving notes on her car. They were broken up and Madison wanted to keep it that way, but Pearson clearly didn't. This was just one of several complaints Madison made starting in April 2023. In another report, she accused Pearson of harassing her using fake social media accounts. Madison's mother had contacted Pearson's mother with concerns about his mental health and was told that the family would handle the situation accordingly. After noticing her ex-boyfriend at the restaurant, Madison and Jackie left to avoid a confrontation. According to police, Pearson charged toward them and attacked them from behind with a knife while they were walking to their car. He allegedly pinned Madison to the ground and stabbed her at least 15 times, leaving her gravely injured. Jacqueline tried to intervene and was stabbed in the forehead and leg. A brave bystander managed to disarm the suspect and was also wounded. In a warrant, police stated that Pearson then caused a horrific, self-inflicted injury to his neck. Madison survived, but has now been left paralyzed by the attack. For now, she remains in the hospital. After being treated for his wounds, Pearson was booked into the St. Johns County Jail on 2 counts of attempted premeditated murder and 1 count of aggravated battery with a deadly weapon causing permanent disability. 15. Parker Julian Bow. When a relationship is short-lived, most people get over it and move on fairly quickly. This wasn't the case with 25-year-old Julian Bow. According to Miami prosecutors, who've accused the young man from North Carolina of relentlessly stalking a woman he only dated for 3 months. An arrest warrant claims that Bow began harassing the woman about 6 months after the pair broke up. The victim received threatening phone calls and text messages from countless phone numbers and was also contacted on social media. At one point, Bow allegedly made good on his threats to send intimate photos of the woman to her friends and family. According to the warrant, the phone and internet harassment eventually escalated into real-life torment. In late 2021, the victim accused Bow of running her car off the road and then running up to the vehicle and banging on the window. On another occasion, she told police that Bow had knocked on her window at night. She pursued legal recourse in both Florida and North Carolina and was granted multiple protective orders against Bow. But the harassment continued on a daily basis. At its worst, the woman received 300 emails in a single day. Bow also allegedly sent text messages to the victim's sister, threatening to kill both women and the sister's child in gruesome ways. He was finally taken into custody in June of 2023 on suspicion of 12 felonies, including 4 counts each of extortion and written threats to kill, 3 counts of cyber harassment, and 1 count of aggravated stalking. The alleged stalker remains behind bars on a $180,000 bond while he awaits the next step in the case. 14. Zachariah Anderson. In May of 2020, police responded to a request for a welfare check at the Kenosha, Wisconsin home of 40-year-old Rosalio Gutierrez Jr. They found his patio door open and blood all over the apartment, but Gutierrez himself was nowhere to be found. It was clear that he'd met with foul play, but his loved ones struggled to wrap their minds around the situation. Gutierrez was a genuinely nice person who had no known enemies, so it made no sense that he was the victim of what appeared to be a very personal and rage-filled crime. Unfortunately, no one is immune to becoming the target of a mentally disturbed person's uncontrollable anger, and Gutierrez was dating a woman with a very jealous ex when he went missing. Sadie Beecham had broken up with the father of her 3 kids, Zachariah Anderson, several months before Gutierrez disappeared. She was ready to move on, but Anderson wasn't about to let that happen. On the day Gutierrez was reported missing, police visited Anderson's property and discovered a burn pit containing torn clothes and a burned bottle of bleach. Inside the suspect's minivan, they found a piece of carpet that reeked of bleach and blood that was later identified as belonging to Gutierrez. Investigators also uncovered evidence that Anderson had followed Gutierrez and gone to his apartment in the days leading up to his disappearance. At the time they believed Gutierrez was killed, Anderson's phone showed no activity, further suggesting that he was responsible for the victim's fate. The suspect was also seen buying cleaning supplies at Walmart on the night of the alleged murder. Bank records showed that Anderson had recently withdrawn tens of thousands of dollars from the bank, leading police to believe he planned to use the money as an escape fund. On his computer, detectives found a folder dedicated specifically to gathering information about Gutierrez. Gutierrez's body was never found, and it's rare for prosecutors to try someone for murder without a body. But in this case, they felt like they had enough evidence to prove their case, so they went ahead and charged Anderson. At trial, they argued that the defendant was jealous of Beecham's new relationship. Anderson's defense attorneys accused the prosecution of getting tunnel vision and ignoring other possible explanations for Gutierrez's disappearance. But the jury found the evidence compelling enough to convict Anderson of murder, hiding a corpse, and 2 counts of stalking. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, which means that he'll be in his early 80s at his first opportunity of seeing freedom again. 13. Wendy Wine. The Rent a Hitman website holds something of a legendary place in the internet world. It was created in 2005 by a man named Bob Inez, and even if someone hasn't heard of it, it doesn't exactly take a genius to realize that it's a parody. Not only is the website not on the dark web, there are obvious hints all over the page that it's not real. But this hasn't stopped numerous people from submitting serious inquiries about having someone in their life killed. In one of the latest cases, a 52-year-old Michigan woman named Wendy Wine filled out the form in 2020 in hopes that someone would murder her ex-husband. In one message, she wrote that she was surprised the site wasn't on the dark web and expressed her concern about going to jail. But the temptation was planted, and Wine eventually went back onto the website and struck up another conversation with its supposed admin, Guido Finelli, aka Bob Inez. Inez said he went years without checking the site and decided to keep it when he realized it was a useful tool for preventing murders. Bob Inez later told CNN that he always gives a customer 24 hours to cool off and take back their request before going to law enforcement. But when he checked with Wine at the 24-hour mark, she said she was sure she wanted to follow through with the plan. At that point, Inez alerted the Michigan State Police, who sent a plainclothed officer to meet Wine in a parking lot to discuss the details of the job. During the meeting, Wine forked over a $200 cash down payment, promised to pay $5,000 total, and provided the undercover with the victim's home address, workplace, and schedule. She was arrested soon after. Wine pleaded guilty to solicitation of murder and using a computer to commit a crime. She was sentenced to 7 to 20 years in prison. According to records, her earliest possible release date is 2027, and her latest possible release is listed as 2040. At her sentencing hearing, she said she was going through a lot when she committed the crimes, including the recent loss of 8 friends and family members. Wendy apologized to the court, as well as to her family and her ex-husband, and she vowed to attend all the available rehab and mental health programs that were available to her in prison. Her ex-husband had an opportunity to speak at the hearing, but he had nothing to say. 12. Laney Minotti. A man was getting it on with a woman inside his Portsmouth, New Hampshire apartment one night in 2017 when his ex-girlfriend, 23-year-old Laney Minotti, allegedly entered without knocking. She walked right in on the action and was promptly escorted out by her ex-boyfriend, who claimed that Minotti pushed the locked front door open and came back inside. He accused the young woman of scratching both him and the woman he was hooking up with. By the time police arrived, the suspect was no longer at the scene, so a warrant was issued. authorities charged Minotti with burglary, trespass, simple assault, and domestic violence simple assault. No other information was available when the story broke, and the outcome of the case is unclear. 11. Christy Falcons. People do shady things on the dark web, but even its most seasoned users typically draw the line somewhere. In early 2019, the FBI received a tip from the administrator of a website advertising hitmen for hire about a woman who'd contacted him with a seemingly serious request to have her ex-husband murdered. The website, Besa Mafia, was a scam. Its operator was happy to take people's money, but they never actually carried out any of the hits, assaults, or kidnappings that were advertised on the site. In their tip to the FBI, the admin identified 35-year-old Nevada resident Christy Falcons as the person seeking their services. The conversation between Falcons and the website's operator began almost 3 years earlier in February 2016. At first, Falcons' questions were along the lines of how to buy Bitcoin and how to ensure their communications went undetected by law enforcement. She also wanted to know that the Hitman website was serious about the services it offered. After doing some research, she was skeptical, and she was additionally worried that the person she was talking to was an undercover cop. The admin told Falcons to go ahead and find a hitman on the street if she didn't trust hiring someone online, and the bit of reverse psychology seemed to convince her that Besa Mafia was the real deal. After a few months of talking, Falcons forked over $5,000 worth of Bitcoin for the murder of her ex-husband, who was living in North Carolina at the time. She provided the admin with the victim's address and identified the best time for the murder as the sooner the better. The admin strung Falcons along for as long as possible. They came up with a few excuses for why the first few planned hits didn't pan out, and eventually told Falcons that the hitman had been unable to find a time when her ex-husband was alone. For this reason, a sniper was needed, and it would cost an additional $9,000. Falcons responded, saying she was at the end of her borrowing limit. At some point during the conversation, the admin asked her to explain why she wanted her ex-husband killed. She admitted that she stood to gain money from his death, but that it wasn't her primary motivation for seeking out a hitman. Falcons claimed that her ex abused her during their marriage and alienated her from her children when they separated. She further explained that the people in her life didn't have a lot of money and that she'd already borrowed as much as she could from them to cover her divorce costs. After being reassured that Falcons would receive her retirement, house, and a large life insurance payout, the admin said he would have the sniper carry out the hit and that she could pay them back later. This seemed to come as music to Falcons' ears, based on her prompt response urging for the hitman to get the job done that night. Of course, it didn't happen, and the admin kept Falcon on the hook for a few more weeks. When a certain amount of time went by without her ex-husband being killed, she appeared to get frustrated with the website. In one message, she wrote that if Besa Mafia wasn't going to do the job as promised, then they needed to stop wasting her time and give her a refund so she could take her business elsewhere. She eventually gave up. 3 years later, she was charged with 1 count of using interstate commerce facilities in the commission of murder for hire. Falcons pleaded guilty to the charge. She faced a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison, but it's unclear how much time she was actually ordered to serve. 10. Mark Martin. While most people were watching the Super Bowl in 2021, a California woman, her boyfriend, and her 2 kids were scrambling to escape a house fire. Someone had broken into the garage of their Visalia home, doused the area near the hot water heater with gasoline, and set it ablaze. The flames quickly spread to the couple's cars and elsewhere throughout the house. Thankfully, the family escaped. Investigators initially attributed the cause of the fire to a hot water tank malfunction, but a closer look at the scene revealed that it was a deliberate arson. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood showed a man matching the description of the woman's ex-boyfriend, 38-year-old Mark Martin, riding through the area on a BMX bike, which was his chosen mode of transportation. It wasn't entirely surprising to learn that Martin was a suspect. Prior to the arson, he'd allegedly embarked on a ruthless harassment campaign against his ex-girlfriend, which included voicemails saying that he hoped the woman would burn to death and die as low death. The woman's new boyfriend had found a note on his car warning him to end the relationship. After the fire, Martin was accused of sending his ex a Snapchat stating that he was serious about his plans to start a fire and the amount of fear he hoped it caused her. According to witnesses, Martin bragged about committing the arson less than an hour after he set fire to the home. The most disturbing aspect of the crime is that he was the father of the 2 kids who were inside the house when the blaze broke out. A jury convicted Martin of 4 counts of attempted murder with premeditation and deliberation, 1 count of arson, and 1 count of first-degree residential burglary. He was sentenced to life in prison with the earliest possible parole date of 2051. 9. Kiara Van Lanen. In early February 2023, a Green Bay, Wisconsin woman filed a police report containing wild allegations against her boyfriend's ex-girlfriend, 33-year-old Kiara Van Lanen. According to a criminal complaint obtained by news station WFRV Local 5, Van Lanen had shown up at the woman's home about a month earlier and either kicked or forced her way through the front door. The suspect allegedly threatened to injure the woman, threw a phone at the man, and kicked the woman's car so hard it left a dent in the door. In the complaint, the victim also accused Van Lanen of harassing her on Facebook and making anonymous complaints about her to her workplace in an apparent effort to sabotage her job. When she left that day, the woman said the suspect was there waiting for her. Van Lanen's ex-boyfriend reportedly told police that Van Lanen had hit him in the face with a phone and stabbed him in the knee with a pocket knife during the home intrusion. For reasons that have not been explained, Van Lanen and her ex shared a phone at the time of the incident, enabling the victims to easily access her internet search history, which they turned over screenshots of to the police. According to the complaint, one of the searches was for the contact information of the woman's employer. When police gave Van Lanen a chance to tell her side of the story, she claimed that she was let into the victim's house. She admitted to throwing the phone at her ex-boyfriend and punching him, but said that it only happened after he tried restraining her. Van Lanen denied having any memory of threatening anyone and acknowledged that her emotions got the best of her. She was charged with 2 counts of felony stalking, which each carry a sentence of up to 3.5 years in prison. Felony first-degree reckless endangering of safety, which carries a maximum punishment of 12 years behind bars, and battery, criminal trespass, criminal damage, and disorderly conduct, which are all misdemeanors. The case is ongoing. 8. Derek W. Brown. A Houston woman lived in terror for over a decade at the hands of an unrelenting ex who was undeterred even after he was sent to prison for stalking her. While authorities declined to elaborate on the exact nature of the stalking and harassment, they noted that it was constant and that Derek W. Brown targeted his ex and her family. The woman repeatedly sought help from law enforcement, and in 2011, Brown was charged with stalking. He was convicted of the crime 3 years later and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Just days after his release in 2019, he once again began tormenting his victims. Brown was found guilty of stalking for a second time following a bench trial in 2023. At his sentencing, Assistant District Attorney Erica Robinson Windsor implored the judge to hand down a heavy punishment, pointing out that the victim did everything in her power to seek protection. But no amount of protective orders and criminal complaints seemed to be enough to stop Brown. During the trial, experts reportedly testified that as long as Brown was a free man, the victim's life was in danger. The judge imposed a 35-year sentence, ensuring that he won't get out of prison anytime soon. Finally, after more than 10 years of suffering, his ex and her loved ones have gotten their lives back. They can now focus on healing and enjoy no longer having to live in constant fear. It's scary, but not necessarily surprising when a stalker is released from prison and goes right back to their criminal ways. After all, one of the defining aspects of their behavior is that they often don't stop, even after being arrested and punished. 7. Yan Lessa. There are different levels of revenge. When 47-year-old Yan Lessa of East Aurora, New York, found herself wanting payback on her ex-boyfriend in early 2019, she apparently decided that hiring someone to cripple him would be the most appropriate course of action to take. According to federal authorities, Lessa conspired with someone on the dark web to assault the victim, GZ, who lived in Orlando, Florida at the time. Lessa told the hired help that she wanted her ex-boyfriend's legs and waist broken. She instructed the person to give GZ a good beating and to make it look like a robbery so authorities didn't suspect that it was done out of revenge. The bitter Western New Yorker made it clear that she wanted the victim to sustain lifelong injuries. Ideally, he would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, but hurting him badly enough to require crutches would also suffice. In addition to expressing her desire for someone to beat the daylights out of her ex to the point of leaving him permanently handicapped, Lessa warned that the victim primarily spoke Chinese and that the only English word he understood was money. She paid the alleged hit person roughly $7,000 in Bitcoin, showing just how serious she was about making the beatdown happen. When federal agents asked GZ if he knew of any plans his ex-girlfriend might have to hurt him, he said no, but that she was unstable and totally capable of doing something like this. In a lot of cases, a person seeking these types of services is unknowingly interacting with an undercover agent. This case was particularly concerning because investigators never identified the person Lessa was conspiring with. Lessa was convicted of transmitting in interstate or foreign commerce a communication containing a threat to injure another person. She was spared from federal prison time and was sentenced to 1 year of supervised release. 6. Courtney Iselandsworth. After going their separate ways in 2019, it initially seemed like Courtney Iselandsworth and Louis Jolly had parted on at least somewhat peaceful terms. They dated for 2 years, but Courtney soon began seeing a new man, while Louis also focused on moving on with his life. Eventually, however, Louis became the target of a relentless revenge campaign by his ex-girlfriend. According to authorities, Courtney made as many as 30 fake social media profiles and sent threatening messages to herself, pretending to be Louis. She reported Louis to the police at least 10 times throughout 2022, and he was arrested 6 times based on the false complaints. Louis was criminally charged with assault and stalking, and was hit with a stay-away order and a curfew. After bailing himself out of jail, he was required to wear an ankle monitor while his case played out. He lost his job and, for the most part, his freedom. In addition to blaming Louis for the social media messages, Courtney accused him of calling her from blocked numbers, stalking her and her loved ones, filming her in public and sending her the footage, throwing a brick through her grandmother's window, and damaging the inside of her home. After the first time Louis was arrested, the young woman told police that his behavior only worsened. Louis fought hard for his innocence, and investigators eventually summoned social media data. They connected at least 17 Instagram accounts with Courtney's IP address and email addresses. After enduring a true living hell and being left a shell of a man, Louis finally cleared his name, and prosecutors charged Courtney with perverting the course of justice. During her court proceedings, her defensive attorney blamed her difficult childhood for her cruel behavior. The judge was less than sold on the excuse, especially after considering the traumatic effects Courtney's actions had on Louis and his family. She pleaded guilty to the charge and was sentenced to 10 months behind bars. In Louis's opinion, it was an extremely light punishment considering her actions. He hit such a low point during the harassment that he descended into a severe mental health crisis. Louis felt powerless as he was repeatedly arrested, had his home torn apart by police, and was subjected to disciplinary measures for crimes he didn't commit. He told the UK Mirror that he was plagued by anxiety between arrests, knowing it was not a matter of if, but when police showed up to take him into custody again. And after having 2 cell phones taken away by law enforcement, he didn't bother buying another. Instead, he became a shut-in as he struggled with sleeplessness and alcohol abuse. After all Louis and his family have been through, one can only hope that Courtney Iselandsworth has learned her lesson and will never inflict such devastation on anyone else's life. 5. Scott Quinn Burkett. A few months after connecting with a man named Scott Quinn Burkett through an anime webpage in 2020, a woman flew to Los Angeles to meet her prospective beau. But she quickly discovered during the 3 days they spent together that they didn't have the chemistry she'd hoped for, at least not on her end. She later described his intimacy style as aggressive. The woman tried to end the relationship several times over the following months, but Burkett continued to contact her and nagged her to continue dating him. If she didn't respond on one social media platform or account, Burkett messaged her through another and so on until she replied. The non-stop contact became so overwhelming that the woman's family reached out to Burkett's father and asked for help making it stop. At first, it seemed to work. Burkett messaged the victim saying that he was going to leave her alone, and the woman and her family breathed a collective sigh of relief. But they were unaware that just days later, Burkett went on the dark web and tried to hire a hitman to kill his victim through a website called Internet Killers. Like most murder-for-hire advertisers on the dark web, it wasn't known to follow through with promised hit jobs. A tipster contacted the FBI and reported Burkett's order, which included instructions to make the woman's death look like an accident. He paid $13,000 in Bitcoin. About a month later, an undercover FBI agent contacted Burkett with photos of his ex that were staged to make it look like she was dead. He was apparently satisfied with the job and sent another $1,000 in Bitcoin for further proof of the murder. Of course, in the end he learned that the murder never happened and that he'd been talking to the feds almost the entire time. Burkett pleaded guilty to one count of using interstate facilities to commit murder for hire and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Scott Burkett and his victim barely dated before the woman pumped the brakes on the relationship, if you can even call it that. It would be fair to say that Burkett's level of outrage over things not working out was abnormal. 4. Ex-girlfriend refuses to let go. When a woman from Singapore ended her 5-month relationship with her girlfriend in October 2021, her former partner pestered her to continue their romance. The unwanted contact came daily in the form of emails, calls, and social media messages. In an attempt to get her point across, the woman told her ex to leave her alone, stopped responding to the woman's social media messages, and eventually blocked her. But her former fling allegedly contacted her from new social media accounts' email addresses. The incessant harassment became so disruptive that the victim reportedly had a hard time using her phone throughout the day. As she arrived home from work one day, she saw her ex waiting for her outside her apartment building. She tried to avoid her stalker, but it was no use. According to a police complaint filed by the victim, the suspect physically restrained her in an effort to stop her from going to her apartment. As the victim tried calling the police, the stalker kept trying to snatch her phone from her hands. Luckily, she eventually reached a friend who contacted law enforcement on her behalf. Police came to the scene and made sure she got inside her apartment safely. Just days later, the stalker was back. Once again, she became physically aggressive when the victim tried going to her apartment, grabbing her by the shoulders and demanding that they get back together. The stalker followed and grabbed the woman, then swiped her phone from her hand and disconnected a call she was trying to make to the police before unblocking herself on the victim's social media. Later that night, the victim filed a police report, but the stalking continued. As she got ready for work one day, she saw her obsessed ex outside and was afraid to leave her apartment. Even after she got a no-contact protective order, the stalker continued bothering her. Authorities eventually arrested the suspect with stalking, and while she avoided jail time, the judge imposed the maximum fine of $5,000. 3. Aaron Clark. Shortly after midnight on December 4th, 2022, an uncontrollable fire broke out at a home just outside Philadelphia in Darby Township, Pennsylvania. 20-year-old Olivia Drasher, who suffered from cerebral palsy, was unable to escape the blaze alive. Her caretaker was seriously injured trying to save her, and her twin sister and mother survived. Drasher's sister, Amira Rogers, wasn't home at the time of the fire, but she was most likely the intended target of it. Investigators learned that less than 24 hours before the house was engulfed in flames, Rogers had broken up with her now ex-boyfriend, 30-year-old Aaron Clark. She told police that she'd caught Clark talking with another woman. When she told him their relationship was over, he allegedly choked her. It was just one of several instances of Rogers accusing Clark of being violent, according to authorities. Months earlier, she claimed that her ex had hit her over the head with a laptop hard enough to crack it. After the post-breakup assault that preceded the fire, Rogers left Clark's house and ignored her phone. She said that Clark text messaged her non-stop and called her over 300 times throughout the rest of the day, and that he threatened to post intimate photos of her on social media and show the images of her friends and co-workers. When threats didn't elicit a response, Clark sent Rogers a message saying he messed his ankle up and asking for help. Until the breakup, the former couple worked the same shift at a US Postal Service distribution center. Rogers spoke with her boss immediately afterward and changed shifts. Nobody knew except her supervisor and manager, which means that if Clark was responsible for setting her house on fire in the middle of the night, he probably thought she was home at the time. He also allegedly knew that her disabled sister was home, and that he was starting the fire on the side of the house that Olivia lived in. All things considered, detectives were quick to zero in on Clark as their top suspect. In addition to having a motive for the crime, a man matching his appearance was seen on surveillance footage near Rogers' home on the night of the fire. During a search of Clark's home, police said they found clothes matching the outfit in the surveillance footage, and that they stunk like smoke and gasoline. A neighbor who was familiar with Clark claimed that they saw him at the crime scene, close enough to make direct eye contact. Authorities charged Clark with murder, arson, stalking, and various other crimes. Even after he was in custody, he somehow kept texting Rogers. When officers tried to strip search Clark, he was uncooperative. They eventually subdued him and found an Apple Watch in his rectum. As Rogers and her family put their life together after losing a beloved family member and everything they owned, Clark remains behind bars awaiting the next steps in his case. 2. David Wayne Hembrick. After dating from fall 2017 to May 2019, a Wyoming woman listed in court documents as TB ended her serious relationship with David Wayne Hembrick, who was in his early 50s at the time. They were friends with benefits for the next several months, but Hembrick continued pushing for a deeper commitment, and TB broke things off for good on Valentine's Day 2020. According to records, Hembrick barraged the woman with questions and told her that if she didn't answer, he'd show up at her house and ask. TB complied in hopes of appeasing her overly attached ex, and she made it clear that she didn't want him at her home. Instead of the situation dwindling over time like the victim had hoped, Hembrick only grew more persistent. The ex-girlfriend repeatedly told him to leave her alone, and he allegedly did the exact opposite and stepped up his campaign of unwelcome contact. Hembrick was accused of driving by the woman's house repeatedly and at all hours, ignoring her repeated commands to stop, and he eventually began driving past her workplace. The victim did what she could to try stopping the incessant harassment. She stopped responding to Hembrick's messages and even blocked him, but stalkers always find a way to torment their target. Things went from alarming to downright terrifying one night when the woman rolled over in bed while talking on the phone and saw Hembrick standing in the doorway of her bedroom. She shoved him out of the house and called the police, who determined that Hembrick had crawled into the house through the doggy door. Shortly after the incident, the ex-girlfriend obtained a no-contact order of protection, which banned Hembrick from going near her or contacting her in any form. But a piece of paper usually isn't enough to stop a bona fide stalker, and just a week after the order went into effect, the woman reported seeing Hembrick drive past her house twice in one night. Police located him in TB's neighborhood and arrested him. Deputy Aaron Lane testified in court that Hembrick claimed he'd just dropped a friend off in the area, but he couldn't name the friend or where they lived, and at that point took Lane into custody. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but was found guilty of stalking and criminal entry and was sentenced to 3 to 6 years in prison. Hembrick appealed his conviction on multiple grounds, but the original ruling was upheld. 1. Marilyn Zoo. Investigators in Mercer County, New Jersey, received a somewhat unusual tip in December 2022 when someone informed them of a woman who was seeking to hire a hitman. According to authorities, 56-year-old Marilyn Zoo of Chadsford, Pennsylvania, wanted her ex-husband's new wife and the woman's daughter killed. She met with an undercover agent posing as a hitman in Trenton to finalize the details and provided him with 2 photos of her ex's wife. Zhao allegedly handed over $21,000 in cash as a down payment for the hit and threw in a towel and some gloves as an added bonus. She promised another $20,000 once the job was done. Prosecutors claimed that she instructed the hitman to kill the woman's teenage daughter if she happened to be at the scene when he went to carry out the hit. Authorities arrested Zhao shortly after the meeting. During a search of her home, they found around $18,000 in cash and several items that they say she'd suggested that the hitman used during the murder. Marilyn Zhao was charged with 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder and 1 count of money laundering. Law enforcement has not announced a possible motive for the crime. According to the most recent available updates on the case, prosecutors had filed a motion to keep Zhao behind bars until her trial. 12. Nancy Gonzalez. While working third shift at a federal prison in New York City in 2012, corrections officer Nancy Gonzalez began a hot and heavy affair with convicted death row cop killer Ronell Wilson. The pair snuck off to a nearby activity room for late-night action multiple times over a several-month period before informants reported the illicit relationship to authorities. According to jailhouse snitches, Gonzalez concocted a scheme to get pregnant by Wilson in hopes that becoming a father would garner enough sympathy to get him off death row. And her timing couldn't have been better, because when the pair conceived, Wilson was facing a new sentencing hearing amid a years-long court battle to spare his life. The fling ended when Wilson was moved to solitary confinement without explanation. In a recorded conversation with her new boyfriend, who was also incarcerated, Gonzalez admitted that Wilson was the father of her baby. Under the law, prisoners are considered incapable of consenting to physical relations. But Gonzalez depicted herself as the real victim, saying she got sucked into Wilson's world and describing herself as vulnerable and wanting to be loved. However, during questioning, she reportedly confessed to getting pregnant on purpose. Authorities charged Gonzalez with abusing a person in custody, and shortly after giving birth to a son, she lost parental rights for driving drunk with the baby in the car. During her court proceedings, her lawyer blamed trauma for Gonzalez's poor decisions, which included intimate encounters with at least 8 fellow guards during the last 2 years she worked at the prison. Meanwhile, the disgraced former corrections officer's last-ditch effort to spare Wilson's life failed, and he was sentenced to death for a second time at his resentencing hearing. Gonzalez pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a year and 1 day in federal prison. And just weeks after Gonzalez's arrest, another corrections officer from New York State made news headlines for shockingly similar reasons. 39-year-old Tyshinia Love Brewster was reportedly 6 months pregnant by an inmate at a state correctional facility when she got busted for the forbidden tryst. The prisoner was relocated and Brewster lost her job and faced criminal charges, but unfortunately, the outcome of the case is unclear. 11. Jesse Dobs. During the pre-dawn hours one day in November 2016, a Baytown, Texas resident overheard gunshots but didn't call the police. Several hours later, officers performed a welfare check at the home of 37-year-old Cynthia Morris at the request of her concerned co-workers. When they entered the house, they found Morris and one of her daughters, Brianna Pavlicek, dead with gunshot wounds in the master bedroom. Law enforcement issued an alert for Morris's other daughter, Kirsten Fritsch, who'd vanished with her boyfriend, 21-year-old Jesse Dobs, in the family's car. Someone spotted the couple that morning, but investigators failed to catch up with them until hours later, when the mother of Dobbs' children told authorities that Dobbs had called her and asked to see his kids. Police traced the phone number to a Texas City nightclub called Shenanigans, where they found the young man wet and shoeless. they picked him up on a resisting arrest charge and questioned him on Kirsten's whereabouts. Dobs reportedly confessed to killing his girlfriend, stating that he killed not the real Kirsten, but the fake Kirsten. He then refused to disclose the location of her body. Kirsten's remains were found behind shenanigans following a 2-day search. She'd been stabbed more than 50 times in the face, neck, and torso, and was also covered in defensive wounds, showing just how hard she fought for her life during her final moments. Authorities charged Dobs with Kirsten's murder. He pleaded guilty but argued in court that he acted with sudden passion. Under Texas law, this means that a crime was committed in the heat of the moment, and that the killer didn't plan the crime but acted out of sudden emotion. The jury rejected Dobs' sudden passion claim though, and they sentenced him to 45 years in prison. He's required to serve at least half his sentence before becoming eligible for parole. Dobs was never charged with the murders of Kirsten's mum and sister, but he remains the prime suspect in the case. 10. Craig Becker. Joanna Hove Becker moved from Sweden to the United States with her parents in 1999 at the age of 6 and grew up to become a psychologist and military wife. In 2013, she moved to Mons, Belgium with her husband, Navy Lieutenant Craig Becker, who was assigned to a NATO post in the country. The couple then went on to have a daughter the following year. In October 2015, police responded to reports of a woman falling or jumping out of a 7th-story window at the Becker's apartment building, and they arrived to find 32-year-old Joanna lying dead on the pavement in a pool of her own blood. Craig told investigators that his wife struggled deeply with addiction and mental illness. Authorities initially ruled that she'd taken her own life, but they reclassified her death as a homicide after an autopsy found high levels of drugs in her system that would have rendered her unconscious. With the amount of medication in Joanna's body, she wouldn't have been able to climb out the window, much less stand up on her own. And a closer look at her injuries and other evidence further pointed toward foul play. Joanna's family insisted that she'd have never willingly abandoned her daughter, and her friends didn't notice anything unusual about her behavior, although like any other person she had some problems in her life. Her marriage to Craig had deteriorated after their daughter's birth, and the couple had separated about a month before Joanna's death. 2 years earlier, she'd accused Craig of hitting and choking her after finding a text message from another man in her phone. But she recanted her criminal complaint against him and the case was dropped. Joanna's friends and family later told police that she feared what Craig might do to her if his career were damaged. After Joanna's death, authorities arrested Craig on suspicion of murder. He languished in Belgian custody for the next 2 years until the US Navy finally became willing to prosecute the case. Craig adamantly maintained his innocence and seemed eager to get the court proceedings over with so he could clear his name and go back to living a normal life, but that never happened. According to court documents, he became enraged after learning that Joanna was seeing a new boyfriend. At the time, she'd just paid a deposit on her own place and was about to move out of the home she and Craig shared. Shortly after discovering Joanna's new relationship, Craig drugged her wine with a powerful cocktail of sedatives and painkillers, including a surgical-grade anesthesia drug called midazolam. After rendering his estranged wife unconscious, he sent her plummeting to the pavement 7 stories below. Craig was also accused of impersonating Joanna by using her phone to send text messages to himself, making it appear as though she was interested in reconciling. Craig didn't erupt into the type of frenzied rage typically associated with a crime of passion. In fact, it was evident that he planned the murder. However, he acted on short notice after slowly boiling over with fury toward Joanna and reaching a point of no return with his anger. In the end, he was found guilty of assault, conduct unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman, and murder. And as a result, the court sentenced Craig Becker to life in prison without parole. 9. Taquan Long. 36-year-old New York City resident Joan Gravett was shot multiple times in broad daylight and was left for dead in 2016 at the hands of her jealous ex-boyfriend 29-year-old Taquan Long. The fatal shooting happened in the hallway of Grevent's apartment building in Far Rockaway, Queens. Taquan went on the deadly rampage after becoming suspicious that the victim had cheated on him with her neighbor. The relationship had recently ended, and Joanne had obtained a restraining order against Taquan, but a piece of paper wasn't enough to keep him away. After gunning Joanne down in cold blood, Taquan continued to pull the trigger repeatedly as he followed Barbara Romano, the mother of the man he thought Joanne was cheating with, into the building's lobby. Barbara was shot in the hand as she ducked for cover behind a security desk and crawled to a nearby boiler room where she dialed 911. Luckily, she survived her injuries. Joanne's neighbors and relatives described the victim's 5-year relationship with Taquan as rocky. They said Taquan had a history of being violent and threatening toward Joanne, and that his anger issues had recently worsened due to his drug use. And just a few months before Joanne's murder, he was charged with assault for allegedly throwing a shoe at her and hitting her with a lamp. On the day of the shooting, Taquan called Joanne's neighbor Johnny Kelly, the man he thought she was cheating with, and left multiple threatening voicemails stating that there would be bloodshed if Johnny didn't give him money. He also allegedly charged Johnny in a subway station with a crazed look in his eyes just minutes before he opened fire on Joanne. Johnny later told the New York Times that he begged Joanne to come into his apartment where she could be safe from Taquan, but she didn't seem to think she was in serious danger and insisted on staying at home. The scorned shooter fled the crime scene and remained on the run for over a month before being captured in Sacramento. He was then extradited to New York on suspicion of murder, attempted murder, and other charges. And in the end, a jury convicted Taquan of all counts, and he was sentenced to 45 years to life in prison. 8. Nicholas Holbert. While stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 23-year-old U.S. Army medic Kelly Bordeaux became a regular at a bar called Froggy Bottoms in North Fayetteville. On what began as a typical Friday night in April 2012, she headed to her watering hole, ready to cut loose after a long and stressful work week. Kelly didn't drink enough to get drunk, but she made sure she had a designated driver anyway. But shortly after midnight, she left Froggy Bottoms with her DD, Nicholas Holbert, and was never seen or heard from again. In Kelly's mind, she and Nicholas were platonic friends. She thought of him as a drinking buddy, and nothing more. And with an estranged husband she was thinking about divorcing and a new long-distance boyfriend named Justin Thompson in the picture, her plate was full as far as relationships went. At the time, Thompson was living in Florida. He'd met Nicholas Holbert during a previous visit to see Kelly and had gotten creepy vibes from him. Thompson was upset when he learned that Kelly was relying on Holbert for a ride home. Not because he thought she might cheat, but because he was worried for her safety. Helpless to protect Kelly from hundreds of miles away, Thompson urged her to take pepper spray, but unfortunately she brushed off his concerns. Holbert was a drifter who worked at the bar part-time and lived in the forest behind it. Following Kelly's disappearance, he told police he dropped her off outside her apartment and had no idea where she went after that. Law enforcement didn't believe him, but they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, especially since Kelly was merely a missing person at that point and it was unclear whether any crimes had been committed. Holbert maintained his innocence and acted worried about his missing friend. He assisted in a search for Kelly, which failed to turn up any sign of her, and even went on the news and pleaded with the public for information regarding her whereabouts. Kelly remained missing for the next 2 years, while a determined private investigator named David Marshburn turned it into his new full-time job to befriend Holbert and get him to talk. In the beginning, Marshburn focused on gaining Holbert's trust and even helped him out financially. Later on in his mission, Marshburn claimed to have police connections and said he could get Holbert a cushy plea deal, even though it wasn't true. All Holbert had to do in exchange for a promised slap on the wrist was divulge the details of what happened to Kelly and where her body was. Holbert initially took the bait, but then he got nervous and backed down to the 11th hour. So, in a last-ditch attempt to get him back on the hook, Marshburn told him he was about to be indicted for murder, which once again wasn't true. This revelation quickly got Holbert back on board with the phony plea offer and led Marshburn to Kelly's shallow grave, which wasn't far from the campsite where he lived. And in a chilling confession, Holbert admitted to killing Kelly in a jealous rage after realizing that she only saw him as a friend. As he watched her act kindly with other guys at the bar while paying little attention to him, Holbert became consumed with anger, but maintained his composure for the time being. But at some point during the night, someone warned Kelly that Holbert had prior convictions for assaulting women. She then refused to get in Holbert's vehicle after leaving the bar, so he attacked her and knocked her unconscious. And when Kelly woke up to Holbert on top of her and tried to fight him off, he bludgeoned her repeatedly in the head with a rock. He then buried Kelly's body and went back to the bar to continue drinking. After realizing he'd been duped into confessing, Holbert pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole. 7. Oscar Soless. While finishing his shift in Pasco County, Florida one night in April 2023, 59-year-old Uber Eats driver Randall Cook pulled over to text his wife and let her know that he'd be home soon. But he went radio silent and never came home, causing his wife to grow increasingly worried as her text messages went unanswered. After waiting several hours, she reported Cook missing to the police. Officers then obtained Cook's last known location from Uber Eats and visited the address. Surveillance footage provided by a household member and the resident showed Cook approaching the house with a delivery around the time of his disappearance. But the clip suddenly cut out right after he reached the door, at which point investigators believe Cook was yanked inside the home. Video from the next day appeared to show two people, including a man later identified as 30-year-old Oscar Soless, placing multiple garbage bags and a cooler alongside the home. And when officers looked inside the bags, they found the missing driver's dismembered remains. They also recovered Cook's wedding ring and car keys from inside the home. Soless has known ties to a faction of the notorious MS-13 gang in Indiana, as well as an extensive criminal record filled with violent convictions for past offenses. He'd recently moved to the Sunshine State after being released from prison. The 315-pound parolee, whose face is almost entirely covered in tattoos, worked as a bouncer at a strip club. Police took Soless into custody for failing to register as a felon in Pasco County and later charged him with first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. At the moment, he's being held without bail while the case proceeds in court. Describing Cook's murder as demonic and a horrific crime of passion, Pasco Sheriff Chris Nocco said that law enforcement was working diligently to identify any connections between Soless and the victim. As things currently stand, it appears as though the murder was random, and the Cook unknowingly entered the path of a raging psychopath whose actions cannot be understood by any sane person or anyone with a shred of conscience. About a month after the gruesome slaying, prosecutors announced plans to pursue the death penalty against Soless, citing the particularly horrifying and cruel nature of the unprovoked crime. 6. Brenda Lazaro. Late one night in early February 2014, police in Coppell, Texas received a 911 call from a hysterical woman who claimed that her boyfriend had shot himself in his apartment. Officers arrived to find 27-year-old Jonathan Cruz dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. The victim's girlfriend of 3 months, Brenda Lazaro, claimed that the injury was self-inflicted. Jonathan's family immediately suspected Brenda of lying. Although Jonathan had a history of depression, he hadn't shown any recent signs of being in a potentially harmful state of mind. For the most part, he seemed happy about how things were going and excited about his future. In fact, according to some of his friends and relatives, the only major problem in Jonathan's life was his relationship with Brenda. On several occasions, those closest to him had noticed troubling signs of possible jealousy and possessiveness. Speaking with Dateline in 2023, Jonathan's mother said that she had to tell her son to put his phone down during a family vacation. At the time, he'd just started dating Brenda, and they were already texting constantly. This could be a perfectly normal example of a new couple caught up in their excitement for each other, but in hindsight, it seemed like one of many red flags symbolizing an unhealthy attachment between the pair. During a double date one evening, Brenda allegedly became infuriated with Jonathan for giving his friend's wife Emily a friendly hug. Her anger over Jonathan and Emily's platonic friendship only grew with time, according to Jonathan's sister Danny Cruz, who told Dateline that her brother ended the relationship over Brenda's controlling ways the day before his death. The family's suspicions were heightened when Brenda failed to attend Jonathan's funeral. To this day, they believe that Jonathan broke up with Brenda and that she showed up at his apartment to try persuading him to continue the relationship. According to their theory, an argument broke out and Brenda shot Jonathan in a fit of anger when she didn't get her way. Brenda maintained her innocence and claimed she was a welcome guest at Jonathan's apartment. She was never arrested or charged in connection with the case, and Jonathan's manner of death remains undetermined. Some investigators allege that the forensics can't rule out an accident or self-inflicted wound, while others claim that based on the evidence, it would have been impossible for Jonathan to be responsible for what happened to him. His family spent years urging the authorities to continue treating the incident as a possible homicide, but they chose not to. The case is inactive and, for all intents and purposes, classified as an unfortunate tragedy. In the absence of a criminal case against Brenda, the Cruz family pursued justice in civil court via a wrongful death lawsuit, which went to trial in 2022. A jury awarded them $206 million in damages, which they know they'll likely never see, but they made it clear long ago that the principle of the matter is more important than the money. Brenda has since gone married and is now a mother of two. And while she's innocent in the eyes of the law, some people remain convinced that she got away with murder. 5. Gibson Paul. Breakups are understandably upsetting, but 29-year-old Gibson Paul took his reaction to a whole new level on Valentine's Day in 2011 after learning that his girlfriend, Tomika Peterson, was planning to leave him. Tomika was going to change the locks on her home in Riviera Beach, Florida, but never got the chance before Gibson uncovered her plan. As she tried to leave the residence with some friends, Gibson approached her car and repeatedly asked Tomika if she was leaving him. When she didn't answer to his satisfaction, he opened fire on the vehicle, striking Tomika and one of her friends. Another friend jumped into the driver's seat and rushed to the nearest hospital, but sadly, Tomika died from her injuries. Gibson then fled the state and immediately became the subject of a federal manhunt. After allegedly threatening to kill any cop who tried to arrest him and saying that he'd not be taken alive, authorities were especially determined to capture him before he could harm anyone else. Fortunately, Gibson made it easy for law enforcement to locate him by leaving his cell phone on while in hiding. Police tracked him to a motel 800 miles from the crime scene in Kingsport, Tennessee, where his van was found sitting right outside the building. He was taken into custody without incident and was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated assault, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and being a felon in possession of a firearm. And in the end, Gibson was sentenced on all counts and was sentenced to life in prison. 4. Michael Pagel. Most people who knew 41-year-old Renee Pagel thought of her as one of the kindest people they'd ever met. Known for her giving nature, the recently divorced mother of 3 from Rockford, Michigan even donated her kidney to the father of one of her nursing students, a man she barely knew in 2006. But no human being is universally liked, and Renee was no exception. Just days after the kidney operation, Renee's parents found her dead in her bedroom. They quickly realized that there was too much blood, and her injuries were too severe for her death to be the result of post-surgery complications. Someone had stabbed Renee dozens of times in the face, head, and torso in an apparent rage before fleeing the scene with the murder weapon. Several persons of interest were quickly ruled out, including Renee's brother-in-law Charles Pagel and a tenant who rented an apartment above her horse barn. Authorities soon turned their attention toward her ex-husband Michael Pagel, who'd recently come out on the losing end of an acrimonious divorce. During the couple's marriage, Renee was the breadwinner and Michael was a stay-at-home dad. When the pair split, Michael expected to win primary custody of the kids and to receive alimony payments. He also wanted the house. But in the eyes of the judge, there was no reason for Michael not to get a job. So he awarded the house and primary custody of the kids to Renee and ordered Michael to pay alimony. Michael was enraged by the ruling, which came just weeks before Renee's murder. He certainly had a motive to kill his ex-wife, and he acted suspicious right off the bat by refusing to speak to detectives and referring them to his lawyer. Investigators lacked enough evidence to charge him with the crime, and the case remained unsolved for the next 13 years. A break finally came in 2019 though, when Michael's brother Charles contacted Renee's friend Chris Crandall, who was leading a renewed effort to gather information on the case. He said that the people who suspected Michael of killing Renee were right about what kind of person he was. Without going into much detail, Charles claimed that his brother had gone crazy and expressed fear that he'd be the next victim. But when Crandall pushed him for details about the murder, he claimed he didn't know anything. Charles eventually told police 5 years after Renee's death that Michael had shown him the murder weapon and had said he'd used it to finalize his divorce in 2011. He threw the blade into a nearby river, where it remained until Charles revealed its location to investigators. When asked why he didn't come forward earlier, he claimed that Michael had threatened to kill him if he told anyone what he knew. Armed with new evidence, prosecutors were finally able to charge Michael in 2020. And after realizing how high the deck was stacked against him, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 25 to 50-year sentence. He apologized for his actions in court, yet he passed the buck by accusing Charles of helping to plot the crime and of being the actual killer. But authorities never found any evidence to suggest that this was the case. They continued to believe that Michael acted alone in a fit of rage when he could no longer contain his anger at Renee over the outcome of the divorce. 3. John Hamilton. 52-year-old John Hamilton was a well-known doctor in Oklahoma City with a reputation for being calm and mild-mannered. He was also romantic and generous, perhaps to a fault, and showed his love for his wife Susan by spoiling her with expensive gifts and vacations. The couple tied the knot in 1987 and were married for 14 years. And from the outside looking in, they seemed to have the kind of relationship most people hope for. That all changed though on Valentine's Day in 2001, when John dialed 911 and reported that he'd discovered Susan dead in a pool of blood when he stopped home during a work break. Susan had been strangled with 2 neckties and bludgeoned in the head with such force that her brain matter was exposed. John was hysterical and covered in blood when police arrived. He seemed genuinely distraught, but his story didn't add up. He said he'd tried performing mouth-to-mouth on Susan, but there was no blood on his face. He suggested that Susan had been targeted by anti-abortion activists who were known to picket outside his office, but it seemed unlikely to investigators. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. Detectives also noticed a distinct lack of bloody footprints, which was unusual given Susan's manner of death. While processing the scene, police found the Valentine's Day card that Susan had given John that day. The note written inside hinted toward problems in the marriage, stating, "I bought this 2 weeks ago, so I guess maybe it doesn't seem as appropriate, but I do love you. Have a good day, Susan." According to a friend, Susan had recently discovered some suspicious calls John had made to a stripper. John tried claiming that the young woman was just a patient who'd reached out to him personally for help. But Susan didn't buy it, and she believed John was having an affair. The couple had also recently argued over money. While en route to the police station for questioning, officers noticed that John was rubbing his hands against the squad car's mesh divider, leading them to wonder if he was trying to conceal injuries he'd sustained while attacking his wife. An overview of his movements revealed that he was late for his second scheduled operation of the day, creating a big enough window of time for him to have committed the crime. Authorities charged John with Susan's murder, but he received widespread public support even as the dirty laundry about his suspicious calls with the topless dancer were revealed. Many people struggled to see John as anything other than a pillar of the community, and while they were quick to admit he overstepped his professional boundaries with the stripper, his supporters refused to believe he was capable of murder. In fact, the alleged mistress became a convenient scapegoat for many who didn't want to face the reality that the beloved doctor was a cold-blooded wife killer. Prosecutors accused John of losing his temper and killing Susan during an argument, leaving the house to perform a surgery and returning home afterward to discover the murder scene. The most convincing testimony came from a blood spatter expert, who explained how marks on John's shirt were indicative of a beating in progress rather than someone tending to a victim after an attack. And after deliberating for just 2 hours, the jury found John guilty of Susan's murder. He was sentenced to life without parole and remained behind bars after appealing his case multiple times. 2. David Anthony Burns. 19-year-old Courtney Coco was last seen alive at her family's home in Alexandria, Louisiana in October 2004. 3 days later, her remains were found in an abandoned building nearly 200 miles away in Winnie, Texas. Her cause of death was unclear due to the heavily decomposed state of her body, but the circumstances of the case were enough to rule the manner of death as a homicide. Courtney had no known ties to anyone in Winnie, and the handful of people who initially fell under law enforcement's radar were ultimately cleared of any involvement in the young woman's murder. Investigators hoped for a break in the case when they located Courtney's car in Houston, but the people in possession of the vehicle were also released without charges. DNA analysis of blood found in the trunk turned up as a match to Courtney, indicating that the killer had used her car to transport her dead body. But authorities were never able to figure out how the vehicle ended up in the possession of the people who were caught driving it. The case quickly became a whodunit, and over time detectives began to wonder if Courtney had been killed by a complete stranger. But in 2011, several witnesses came forward, claiming that David Anthony Burns, the former fiancé of Courtney's older sister Lace Evans, had confessed to smothering Courtney to death with a pillow. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and the investigation once again hit a standstill. Police finally arrested Burns in 2021, more than 16 years after the murder, following a renewed effort to solve the case and the discovery of a key witness who was able to place him at the scene where Courtney's body was dumped. According to prosecutors, Courtney was secretly seeing Burns romantically, even though he was engaged to her sister. On the night of her death, she was home alone watching her family's dogs while they were out of town. Courtney had recently received a large inheritance, and the crime scene showed signs of a burglary. And according to witnesses, Burns had admitted to having financial motives. But some people speculated that the murder was the product of more than just a burglary, and that something went terribly wrong between Courtney and Burns that night. While prosecutors never speculated that Burns was afraid Courtney would expose their affair, the very nature of their relationship makes it hard not to wonder if this was a factor. Burns maintained his innocence throughout his trial, but failed to sway the jury in his favor. And in the end, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. 1. George Stephen Birch. During what was supposed to be a fun night out with friends in Green Bay, Wisconsin in 2016, 31-year-old mother of 3, Nicole van der Heijden, got into a heated argument with her boyfriend and the father of her youngest child, 35-year-old Douglas Dentry. She left for another bar without Dentry and was still out when he arrived at the couple's home later that night. Dentry initially assumed that Nicole had spent the night at a friend's house, but when she failed to return home the next morning, he reported her missing. Immediately suspicious of Dentry, police questioned why he waited so long to report Nicole's disappearance. That same day, her body was found in a field just 3 miles from where the couple lived. Nicole's remains had been beaten and strangled to death in a manner so brutal that it shocked even the most seasoned detectives on the case. Meanwhile, the more detectives learned about Dentry's relationship with Nicole and the events leading up to her murder, the more convinced they became that Dentry was the killer. People who knew the couple described a relationship that seemed perfect at first. Over time, however, they began to have issues. In a recent text message to a friend, Dentry had mentioned that he was considering ending the relationship and asking Nicole and her kids to move out. And after storming off the night before, Nicole had sent Daughtry a slew of text messages accusing him of being an abusive cheater. At one point, she tried calling him and he didn't pick up. But he answered the phone when Nicole called from a friend's phone, which only further fueled her anger. Nicole left the bar upset and was last seen walking down the streets into the darkness. Following the discovery of her body and several of her belongings that were found scattered throughout the area, police managed to obtain a male DNA profile from the evidence. Confident that Daughtry would be a match, they arrested him and held him in custody while awaiting the results. But not only was Daughtry not a match, items from his house that were initially taken as evidence ultimately proved to have no connection to Nicole's murder. His Fitbit data further showed that he only took 12 steps in the window of time during which the crime was committed, and as a result, Daughtry was eliminated as a suspect and released from jail. The DNA implicated a 40-year-old man from Virginia named George Stephen Birch, who initially claimed that he'd hooked up with Nicole in his vehicle after giving her a ride home. He said it happened in her driveway, which sounded extremely unlike Nicole to anyone who knew her. She wasn't the type to cheat on her boyfriend or to have a casual encounter, and she was far out of Birch's league as far as looks went. Birch changed his story though when cell phone data put him at the scene where Nicole's body was dumped. He then claimed that Daughtry came outside and killed Nicole right in front of him after catching them in the act. Birch accused Daughtry of forcing him to dispose of Nicole's body at gunpoint and said he complied because he was afraid for his life. Prosecutors, however, claimed that Birch flew into a rage and murdered Nicole with his bare hands when she resisted his advances. He then dumped her body and threw her belongings out his car window as he drove away. George Stephen Birch was convicted of murder and was sentenced to life without parole. He continues to challenge his case from behind bars, hoping he'll eventually win back his freedom on a legal technicality or convince a court to believe his ridiculous version of events. Would you rather have a co-worker who's prone to throwing explosive tantrums, making you wonder how far their behavior will escalate in the future, or an eerily quiet and socially awkward co-worker who's never lost their temper in your presence but seems like they could snap at any moment? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.